Week 4, Naturalism. By the end of the 19th century, naturalism, the first offshoot of realism that we'll be discussing, had begun to develop its own set of techniques. There are many reasons as to why this new style of writing came about. Modern literary theorists partially blame this shift on what is known as the crisis of representation, the difference between the representation and the thing represented. For example, because Mark Twain used a good deal of humor and exaggeration in his writings in order to depict his pessimism about mankind, many readers failed to see a truly realistic representation of society. While realist writers understood that language was an interpretation of the real rather than the real thing itself, they still insisted that their work called attention to areas of experience that literature had not dealt with before, and made such areas legitimate subjects for serious writing. The naturalists believed that more could be done to create a truer reality through written works. Naturalism, on the other hand, can be thought of as either a version of realism or an alternative to it. Naturalists, unlike the realists for whom human beings define themselves within recognizable settings, wrote about human life as it was shaped by forces beyond human control. For them, their view was truly realistic. This style of writing introduces characters from the fringes and depths of society, rather than the middle class, whose fates are determined by degenerate heredity, a sordid environment, and/or a good deal of bad luck. Additionally, these lower-class characters were seen to have less control over their lives than those who were better off. Significantly influenced by Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, published in 1859, naturalist writers sought to make their work almost scientific, making their writings as close to real life as possible. They focused on deep social problems caused by industrialization, a loss of morality, alienation, and overcrowded cities, the lives of the poor and the outcasts, and the overwhelming environmental and hereditary forces that alter a person's ability to make the best decisions. They tended to view people as hapless victims of immutable natural laws. Characters are often ill-educated, and their attempts at exercising free will or choice are typically stopped by forces beyond their control. Stephen Crane is among the most well-known naturalists. He was born on November 1, 1871, and died at the age of 28. As a young man, he was unable to accept the routine of academic life and left for New York City in a literary career, taking up journalistic assignments that allowed him to witness the city close at hand. Here, he was able to develop his skill as an observer of psychological and social reality. In 1893, he published Maggie, a Girl of the Streets, at his own expense. Though it was backed by William Dean Howells, the book did not sell. Maggie told the story of a girl born in the slums of New York who during her short life is driven to prostitution. As one of the first reviewers of the 1893 edition observed, the evident object of the writer is to show the tremendous influence of the environment on the human character and destiny. It remains Crane's fullest treatment of how the urban poor lived in the burgeoning cities of America in the 1880s and 1890s. In 1895, Crane published his novel The Red Badge of Courage, which takes the Civil War as its background for a story about the effect of battle on a young man, winning Crane international acclaim. As a journalist on his way to Cuba, in 1897, Crane's ship the Commodore sank off the coast of Florida. He promptly converted this event into one of the best-known and most widely reprinted of all American stories, The Open Boat. This story reveals Crane's characteristic subject matter, the physical, emotional, and intellectual responses of people under extreme pressure, the dominant themes of nature's indifference to humanity's fate, and the consequent need for compassionate collective action. Charlotte Perkins Gilman was a writer and lecturer on women, labor, and social organization. Born in Hartford, Connecticut on July 3rd of 1860, she lived a painful and lonely childhood. Her father abandoned his family shortly after her birth, and her mother withheld from her children all physical expressions of love, hoping to prevent their later disillusionment over broken relationships. She entered into her marriage with Charles Stetson in 1884 reluctantly, anticipating the difficulties of reconciling her ambition to be a writer with the demands of being a wife, housekeeper, and mother. Following the birth of her daughter Catherine, Gilman became increasingly despondent and marital tensions increased. Her husband and her mother were convinced that Gilman needed rest and willpower to overcome her depression. They persuaded her to get treatment from Dr. S. Ware Mitchell, the most famous American neurologist of the day. A specialist in women's nervous disorders, Mitchell usually prescribed what was known as a rest cure, consisting of total bed rest for several weeks and limited intellectual activity thereafter. She claimed that during this time she came so near to the borderline of utter mental ruin that I could see over. A few years later, she wrote her most famous story, The Yellow Wallpaper. As she concluded, it was not intended to drive people crazy, but to save people from being driven crazy, and it worked. In 1898, Gilman published Women in Economics, a powerful feminist manifesto that argues that women's economic dependency on men stunts not only the growth of women, but that of the whole human species. Gilman committed suicide in 1935 after learning that she had inoperable cancer. For this week's discussion, consider the following question. In what ways does The Open Boat depict characteristics of naturalism? The Yellow Wallpaper? In your opinion, should the latter be considered a work of realism or naturalism? Why?